G'day, Professor Joseph Drew here. I'm here to talk to you this time about paid parking, but paid parking with a specific mission, and the mission is to capture some revenue from the tourists that visit your local government area. So what's the problem? What's the problem with tourists? There's no problem at all. Lots of businesses rely on them. It's a good thing. But we need to be fair about how we provide local government goods and services. And the truth of the matter is your tourists use public goods and some of them not so public goods when they visit your local government area. They'll use your roads, they'll use your footpaths, they'll use your toilets, you're providing beach patrols and things like that, rubbish. It all costs. Now the question is, who should pay, who should internalise the cost of being a tourist? Should it be the tourists themselves, or should it be your local government taxpayers? Because they're the only two alternatives realistically. If you're not collecting revenue from your tourists, it means that the ratepayers are going to be picking up the tab for someone else's day out, for someone else's fun. Now, one really good way of picking up some of this revenue is through paid parking. Now, this was actually an idea of one of my master's students, very clever student, but I'll keep her name out of it so I don't embarrass her. But it is a brilliant idea. There's not too many options open for local governments in Australia, at least. One of them is paid parking. So if you've got a tourist strip and you don't have paid parking, you need to ask yourself, why not? There's companies that administer the machines and things and take a cut for doing so. The revenue can be used to offset the costs that the burdens that the tourists are placing on the taxpayers. Now, I know some businesses profit from having tourists. Great, I'm happy for them. But there's a lot of businesses that don't. And why should they be paying the costs of having tourists when they get no benefit out of it at all? Most of your local residents won't benefit from tourists at all. Why should they be paying extra taxes to subsidise the cost of having tourists to provide them with the roads and the beach patrols and the rubbish collection and the public toilets and all the other things? So it's an issue of fairness. As I often say, local government, all government, is a moral endeavour. The only reason we have government in the first place is for moral reasons. So we need to be really careful and moral about how we match revenue and expenditure. And it's quite reasonable. In fact, it would be unreasonable to do differently. It's quite reasonable to collect some revenue from the tourists in order to offset some of the burden that they place on the wider body of taxpayers. So one of the obvious objections is, what about locals? Why should they have to pay? Well, in some respects, if they're using a car park, they're internalising some benefit. It's not unreasonable for them to pay a little bit towards the benefit. But if this is a real obstacle or a roadblock to you, well, issue them with coupons, parking coupons, so that the locals don't have to pay. Give them a set number of coupons so that they can't share them out amongst their friends coming from other shires, and allow them to use these coupons or tokens instead of having to pay for parking. So there goes one objection. Another objection is, oh, business won't like it. If you charge them, they'll get less tourists. Well, no, the research and scholarly evidence says they won't get less tourists. What they'll do is get a higher frequency of turnover of tourists in those paid parking spots. Now, for most businesses such as cafes, restaurants, souvenir stores, they're much better off to get 6 or 7 different people using a parking spot during the day, rather than getting one tourist that parks in there and sits there all day. The one tourist is only going to buy one lunch. If you get 6 or 7 people, because there's a bit of a rotation with the car parking, because all of a sudden there's a cost associated with it, you might get 6 or 7 customers. So in all likelihood, it will be better for the businesses because they'll get more tourist turnover. Another objection is tourists will stop coming. Well, unless you're planning on charging some astronomical fee, I doubt it. You think of a place, Byron Bay or something like this. People will drive 50, 100, couple hundred kilometres. People drive from Sydney up there for the weekend. Now you think about the cost of the fuel and the wear and tear on the car. They've just spent a couple $100 getting there, and you think they're going to be worried about $5 for an hour for parking? And there's always options. You make sure there's options. One of the options is they park further away and walk if they really object to paying. But I think if you communicate clearly to the community and to the tourists that this money used for paid parking is used to provide services and resources for the tourists themselves. And most tourists, having had spent $50, $100 in fuel to get there, are going to go, yep, you know what? Fine. $4, $5, so I can park here while I have lunch. Fine. It's all in the communication, I feel. So how do you price this? Well, first of all, you need to think about your objectives. So if your objective is to recoup the money you're spending on tourists, well, then you know how much you need to charge. You can do simple surveys, see how much frequency there is in use of parking, and work out an appropriate fee from that perspective. Another one is demand side pricing. I've got a video on this. Have a look at what local shires around you are charging for the same sort of resource. That's good, particularly if you're worried about the tourists going elsewhere. Although, as I say, I assure you someone's not going to change their destination simply because they don't want to pay $5 for a car park. Experiment with the fee. You can change it. So experiment at $6. If you find that it doesn't make much difference to the demand for car parking, that you're not getting a lot of illegal car parking, you're not getting a lot of complaints, consider putting it up. Or if the reverse has happened, consider putting it down. It's called discretionary pricing. Play with it a little bit and find that equilibrium point that people are content enough with. Don't react to every single complaint, because there's some people out there that just want to complain. That's what they do for a hobby. But if you're getting sizable amounts of complaints, the chances are it's not working. If you're getting sizable amounts of illegal parking, chances are it's not working. You need to play with that fee and get it right. And most importantly, with all the fees and charges, and I've said this many times before, review it regularly. Schedule to review it at least once every local government political term, once every 4 years in Australia, but preferably annually. Do not just pop it up by CPI, the inflation rate, annually, because that may not cover your costs. Have a look at what's happening to your cost to service these tourists. Have a look at what's happening to rates. If your rates had to go up by 10%, is it reasonable that tourists might have to pay 10% more as well as their contribution towards paying for the infrastructure that they use? Probably, I think your ratepayers would say yes. So review this regularly, preferably every year, but at least once every 4 years. If you're not reviewing this regularly, you're going without revenue. That's a problem. But also you're not sending the right price signals. And as I've explained to you in other videos, if you don't send the right price signals, people end up consuming inefficient quantities and qualities of the good, which is in no one's best interest. In conclusion, paid parking is a clever option to capture some of the revenue, to cover some of the burden that tourists put on the rest of the taxpayer body. It needs to be handled carefully, and you need to explain things very clearly. And for my mind, it's all about fairness. You know, those of you who don't want paid parking, you need to understand there's the other side of the story. If you're not going to have paid parking, what you're going to do is effectively ask every other taxpayer to pay more to cover the burden of these tourists. And there's ways to get around obstacles and objections which I've gone through. And there's no need for the locals to be charged for this parking. And you can be clear that this is just a way of recouping some of the money we spend on you tourists. And I think most people are reasonable. This is the key teaching of natural law philosophy. I've got a video on that too if you want to watch it, which is if you give good reasons to people for acting, most people are reasonable and they'll go with the flow. Now, if you've enjoyed this video, if you found it helpful, please subscribe, and most importantly, send the link to your mates and other local governments. The whole point of this channel is to help you. So help me help others by spreading the word. Thank you very much for your time. Goodbye.